Everyone, good morning from Educating Path. It is the teaching job vacancy in National Council of Educational Research Training. So, the National Council of Education Research and Training, so it is located in all over India. So, they are recruiting the teaching job vacancy. So, total number of vacancy 292 teaching job vacancy. So all the vacancy under the direct recruitment in NCERT New Delhi. So location Ajmer, Bhopal, Bhubaneswar, Mysore and Shillong branches. So details of the job vacancy for psychology professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 4 vacancy, assistant professor 2 vacancy. For psychology guidelines and counseling associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 4 vacancy. For psychometry in psychology, assistant professor 1 vacancy. For psychology measurement and evaluation, associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 2 vacancy. For psychology educational research, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 2 vacancy. For education in sociology of education, associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 4 vacancy. Philosophy of education, assistant professor 4 vacancy. The special education, professor 2 vacancy, associate professor 4 vacancy, the assistant professor 3 vacancy. The women's studies or general studies or girls education and empowerment, assistant professor 3 vacancy. Teacher education, professor 3 vacancy, associate professor 3 vacancy and assistant professor 5 vacancy. Science education, professor 5 vacancy, associate professor 4 vacancy and assistant professor 6 vacancy. For elementary education, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 3 vacancy and assistant professor 4 vacancy. For environmental education, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 2 vacancy and assistant professor nil. Education, professor 5 vacancy, associate professor 13 vacancy and assistant professor no vacancy. Social science education, assistant professor 7 vacancy. Mathematical education, assistant professor 8 vacancy. Comparative education, professor 1 vacancy and assistant professor 1 vacancy. Educational planning and management, associate professor 3 vacancy. Curriculum development and research policy, professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 2 vacancy and associate professor 2 vacancy. Educational technology, associate professor 3 vacancy. Educational technology media research and evaluation, professor 1 vacancy, professor 1 vacancy. Educational technology multimedia, associate professor 2 vacancy. Educational technology graphics and multimedia, associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Educational technology media production, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 2 vacancy and assistant professor 1 vacancy. Educational technology audio video media production, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Audio video education, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Vocational education, professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Educational statistics, assistant professor 2 vacancy. Child development, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 1 vacancy and assistant professor 2 vacancy. For physics, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 3 vacancy and assistant professor 8 vacancy. Mathematics, professor vacancy 1, as associate professor 5 and assistant professor 5 vacancy. For zoology, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 5 vacancy and the assistant professor 9 vacancy. For chemistry, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 4 vacancy, for assistant professor 9 vacancy. For botany, associate professor 2 vacancy, assistant professor 4 vacancy. For statistics, associate professor 1 vacancy. For sociology, associate professor 2 vacancy, assistant professor 2 vacancy. For history, assistant professor 4 vacancy and professor 1 vacancy. For commerce, business studies, associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 1 vacancy. For political science, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 1 vacancy and assistant professor 3 vacancy. For economics, associate professor 2 vacancy, assistant professor 4 vacancy. For geography, professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 4 vacancy. Physical education, associate professor 1 vacancy, for assistant professor 5 vacancy. Population studies, for associate professor 2, Hindi, associate professor 2 vacancy, assistant professor 1 vacancy. For Urdu, assistant professor 1 vacancy. For English, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 2 vacancy. For Sanskrit, assistant professor 1 vacancy. For Kannada, assistant professor 1 vacancy. For Odia, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Art education, assistant professor 4 vacancy. For theatre and performing arts, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Language education, assistant professor 7 vacancy. Computer science and software development, professor 1 vacancy. Entrepreneurship and management, professor 1 vacancy. Home science, no vacancy. Home science, professor 1 vacancy. Food and nutrition, associate professor 1 vacancy. Pharmacy, professor 1 vacancy and assistant professor 1 vacancy. Animal husbandry, fisheries, agriculture, professor 1 vacancy, associate professor 1 vacancy and assistant professor 1 vacancy. Mechatronics, instrumentation, automatic manufacturing, associate professor 1 vacancy. Interior design and architecture, associate professor 1 vacancy. Renewable energy, electrical and electronics, associate professor 1 vacancy. Business management, marketing and retail, associate professor 1 vacancy. For banking and finance, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Hospitality, travel and tourism, associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Military science, defense science, associate professor 1 vacancy, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Food technology and processing, associate 1 vacancy and assistant 1 vacancy. Librarian, professor 1 vacancy. Assistant librarian, assistant professor 2 vacancy. Vocational education, commerce accountancy, associate professor 1 vacancy. Office management and stenography, associate professor 1 vacancy. Marathi, assistant professor 1 vacancy. Bengali, assistant professor 1 vacancy. So total number of vacancy in associate professor 40, total number of vacancy in professor 40, associate professor 97 and the assistant professor 155. So total number of vacancy in professor teaching job 292. So essential qualifications for the professor: PhD degree with minimum 10 years of experience. For associate professor, PhD degree with 8 years of experience. For assistant professor, PG degree with no experience required. So SLED NET set is qualified is preferable. Those who are waiting for the PhD award, they can also apply. The pay scale for the professor, the pay scale starting from 37,000 to 67,000. For the associate professor, the scale pay starting from 37,000 to 67,000. For assistant professor and assistant librarian, the scale pay starting from 15,000 to 39,000. So apply mode is a online mode. So the website address ncert.nic.in. So last date for applying through online mode is a 28/10/2022 is a last date. 28/10/2022 is a last date. So application fees for unreserved OBC and economically weaker rupees 1000 rupees. For women, SC, ST, welfare, disability candidate, no need to pay for examination fee. So thank you, all the best for your future from Educating Path. Like that, if you want to get the government job notification, then you have to subscribe the Educating Path YouTube channel. And you have to like the video and share the video to your friends and relatives. Thank you.